is my Marcus? Where did he go? How could he abandon me at the hospital? After 3 years, why me?
The woman lying alone in that hospital bed had no idea that the man she was waiting for had already chosen someone else. Danielle Freeman slowly opened her eyes, reached for the empty chair beside her, and realized Marcus was gone. He was supposed to be the man holding her hand, the man she would marry in 3 weeks. Instead, there was only silence. Then Danielle discovered the truth. Marcus hadn't simply abandoned her. He had married her sister, Vanessa. The woman Danielle trusted with her deepest secrets was now wearing the life Danielle thought belonged to her. But while Marcus and Vanessa celebrated, Danielle was fighting to rebuild herself from the hospital bed they had left her in. They thought she was broken. They thought she had nothing left. They were wrong. Because 6 months later, Danielle walked down an aisle of her own. And waiting at the altar was the one man Marcus never expected to see standing beside her, his father. But Danielle wasn't marrying Walter for the reason everyone assumed. And when Marcus finally discovered why she had said yes, it was already too late to stop what was coming. To understand how a woman ends up marrying her ex-fiancé's father, you have to go back 4 years, to a spring evening in Charlotte, when Danielle first brought Marcus Ellison home for dinner. Her mother, Ruth, liked him immediately. He had a practiced kind of charm, the sort that made people feel noticed, remembering the name of a neighbor's dog or the college major of a cousin he had met only once. Vanessa liked him too, though at the time nobody thought to read anything into that beyond ordinary family warmth. Danielle was building a career as a hospital administrator, working long hours she was proud of, and Marcus filled the space around those hours with an attentiveness that felt, in the beginning, like devotion. Walter Ellison, Marcus's father, sat quietly at the head of that first dinner table, watching his son with the kind of attention that noticed things long before anyone said them out loud. Walter had spent 30 years building a mid-sized logistics company from a single delivery truck into a regional operation with contracts across 3 states. He was proud of what he had built, prouder still that he had built it without cutting corners or leaning on anyone else's name. From the very first conversation, he liked Danielle in a way that went beyond politeness. She asked him real questions about the business, about the decisions that had nearly broken him in the early years, and she remembered the answers the next time she saw him. Marcus, by contrast, had never shown much curiosity about the company his father had spent a lifetime building. He wanted the comfort that came with the Ellison name without doing the work that had earned it, and Walter saw that gap clearly, even when he chose not to say it out loud at family dinners. The engagement happened on a Sunday afternoon in April, in front of the whole family, with Vanessa standing closest to the camera taking pictures for everyone else. Danielle remembers being genuinely happy that day, the kind of happy that quiets the instincts a person should otherwise be listening to. She did not notice, in the months that followed, how often Vanessa found reasons to be near Marcus. She did not notice the extra hour he spent helping Vanessa with her car on a Tuesday evening, or the coffee runs that always seemed to require his specific company. She was working double shifts at the hospital, managing a pregnancy she had not planned for but had already fallen in love with, and trusting the 2 people closest to her without a second thought. That trust would cost her more than she ever imagined it could. Ruth would later admit, quietly, that she had noticed things too, small things she talked herself out of because they seemed too petty to mention. Vanessa borrowing an item of Danielle's jewelry and never quite returning it. Vanessa showing up at Marcus's apartment to drop off something small and staying far longer than the errand required. None of it seemed significant on its own. Families rarely notice the shape of a betrayal while it is still being built, only after it has already hardened into something undeniable. Danielle, exhausted from 12-hour hospital shifts and the physical weight of a difficult pregnancy, had no bandwidth left to question the 2 people she trusted most, and both of them understood that better than she did. The pregnancy complications began in her 7th month, sudden and frightening enough that her doctor admitted her for observation with almost no warning. Marcus visited the first 2 days, distracted, checking his phone more than he checked on her, offering short answers to questions that deserved longer ones. By the third day, he stopped answering her calls altogether. Danielle told herself he was overwhelmed, that some men simply did not know how to sit with fear the way women were taught to. She held on to that explanation even as the silence stretched into a fourth day, then a fifth, a string of missed calls that any outside observer would have recognized immediately as an answer in itself. She was alone in that hospital room when the delivery happened early. She was alone when the baby did not survive the night. And she was alone when she woke up afterward to an empty chair that told her everything Marcus had not said out loud. It was a nurse, not Marcus, who eventually told her, gently, that he had called the hospital the day before asking to have his name removed from her emergency contact list. Danielle asked to see the paperwork herself, certain there had been some clerical mistake, and when she saw his signature, dated 3 full days before her emergency admission, she understood for the first time that this had not been panic. It had been planning. Marcus had not abandoned her out of fear in the moment. He had already been quietly building an exit before she was ever admitted, which meant he had known something about the direction things were heading long before he let it show on his face. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The days that followed the delivery blur together in Danielle's memory, a haze of hospital ceiling tiles and hushed conversations happening just outside her door. Her mother sat with her in shifts, unable to reach Marcus by phone, growing more alarmed by the hour at his silence. A social worker checked in twice, gently probing whether Danielle had support at home, a question that landed harder than it was meant to. Danielle answered honestly each time, unsure herself what the true answer was anymore. She was discharged 4 days later into an apartment that still had Marcus's belongings scattered through it, a jacket on the back of a chair, a razor in the bathroom cabinet, small evidence of a life that had, without her knowledge, already quietly ended. The full picture came together 3 weeks after her discharge, when Ruth called in tears to tell her that Marcus and Vanessa had gotten married at the courthouse, quietly, with no family present except one of Vanessa's closest friends serving as witness. Danielle sat with the phone against her ear for a long time after her mother stopped talking, not in shock, but because pieces she had refused to examine were finally arranging themselves into a shape she recognized. The coffee runs, the car trouble that always seemed to require Marcus specifically, the way Vanessa had stopped answering Danielle's calls in the final weeks of her pregnancy, right around the same time Marcus began pulling away too. Her sister and her fiancé had not fallen into anything by accident. They had built it, deliberately, behind a wall of small excuses Danielle had been too exhausted and too trusting to look past. What Danielle did next surprised everyone who thought they knew her, herself included. She did not call Marcus demanding an explanation. She did not show up at Vanessa's new apartment. She spent the first 2 weeks after learning the truth doing almost nothing at all, sitting in her own apartment, answering the door only for her mother, allowing herself to grieve a loss that had more layers than most people ever have to untangle at once. There was the loss of the baby, the loss of the man she had planned a future with, the loss of a sister she had trusted since childhood. Grief like that does not resolve in a straight line, and Danielle did not try to force it into one. But grief, for her, had always eventually turned into motion, and by the 3rd week she had started making a list, not of ways to punish the people who hurt her, but of every conversation she had ever had with Walter Ellison about his company, his succession plans, and the son he privately worried was not ready to inherit what he had spent a lifetime building. Danielle reached out to Walter under the simplest possible pretense, a card expressing sympathy for the awkwardness the situation had placed him in as much as her, along with an offer to return a set of tools Marcus had left behind at her apartment. Walter had spent the weeks since the courthouse wedding in a private fury he had not shared with anyone, not even his closest friends. He had watched his only son marry a woman under circumstances that embarrassed a family name he had spent 30 years building, and he had watched Danielle, a woman he genuinely respected, get discarded in the process without so much as an explanation. When she showed up at his office that afternoon, composed despite everything she had survived, Walter found himself talking to her for 2 hours about things he had never once said to Marcus directly. Their conversations continued over the following weeks, not out of any scheme or strategy at first, but because they were two people who understood a very particular kind of betrayal that only the other could fully appreciate. Walter had built an empire that his son did not respect enough to protect. Danielle had built a life that her sister did not respect enough to leave alone. They talked about the business, about supply contracts and difficult employees, and the mistakes Walter still replayed from decades earlier. They talked about family loyalty and what it actually meant in practice versus what people assumed it meant when they were young and inexperienced. Somewhere inside those long conversations, respect quietly turned into something neither of them had expected walking in. A partnership built on clarity rather than romance. The kind of bond that made complete sense to both of them, even though it would make sense to almost no one watching from the outside. Ruth was the first person Danielle told about her growing closeness with Walter, and her mother's reaction was cautious in a way that surprised Danielle at first. Ruth was not scandalized so much as protective, worried that her daughter was reaching for stability in the wrong direction, worried about how the family and the wider community would perceive a relationship between Danielle and the father of the man who had just left her. Danielle listened to every concern without dismissing it, because she shared some of them herself in quieter moments. But she also noticed something her mother eventually noticed too, that Walter treated her differently than Marcus ever had, with a steadiness and a seriousness that made her feel, for the first time in years, like an equal rather than someone to be managed. By the time Walter proposed, 5 months after that first condolence card, Danielle had already spent countless hours reviewing his company's succession documents at his own request, offering the kind of clear-eyed business judgment Marcus had never once shown interest in providing. She had sat in on meetings with his accountant, walked the warehouse floor with him on slow Saturday mornings, learned the names of drivers who had been with the company for 20 years. Walter did not propose out of loneliness or infatuation. He proposed because he had found, in the woman his son threw away, someone he trusted more with his life's work than he trusted his own bloodline. Danielle said yes for reasons that went far beyond anything resembling revenge, though she would be lying if she claimed Marcus's face never crossed her mind in that moment. She said yes because for the first time since the hospital, someone had looked at her not as a woman to be pitied, but as a partner worth building something permanent with. The wedding was small, deliberately so, held at Walter's home with a handful of witnesses and none of the wider Ellison family invited. Marcus found out through a mutual friend 2 days beforehand and drove to his father's house in a fury that Walter had anticipated and quietly prepared for. The argument that followed was the loudest either man could remember having with the other. Marcus accused Danielle of manipulating a grieving old man out of his fortune. Walter reminded his son, calmly and without ever raising his voice, that grief had nothing to do with recognizing genuine competence once he had finally seen it up close. Marcus left that night without an invitation to the wedding and without the answer he had actually come looking for, which was why his father's company attorney had quietly begun restructuring the ownership documents 2 months earlier, long before that confrontation ever happened. The truth Marcus did not understand yet was that his father's estate had never been the vulnerable, sentimental thing he assumed it to be. Walter had spent 3 decades building safeguards into every corner of that company, protections against exactly the kind of instability that comes from handing control to someone who has never proven he can steward it responsibly. In the wake of his son's betrayal, Walter simply extended those safeguards to include the one person who had proven, repeatedly, and without being asked, that she understood the true value of what he had built. Danielle was not marrying into control of Walter's fortune out of greed. She was marrying into a partnership that recognized her as an equal, something Marcus had never once offered her across 3 full years together, even before the hospital, even before Vanessa. 6 weeks after the wedding, Marcus received a letter from his father's attorney outlining changes to the company's ownership structure, changes that repositioned Danielle as an equal partner in decisions Marcus had always assumed would eventually belong to him alone. He called his father immediately, then Danielle, then his father again, each call growing more desperate as he began to understand the true scope of what had happened while he was busy building a new marriage with Vanessa. This was not about punishment. Walter told him plainly during their final conversation on the subject, his voice steady even as his sons grew louder. It was about protecting something he had spent his entire life building from a son who had never once shown the discipline required to protect it himself. Marcus hung up the phone that day, finally understanding what everyone around him had already seen coming for months. Vanessa's reaction, when the news eventually reached her, was different from her husband's. She did not call Danielle screaming, did not demand an explanation, did not show up uninvited the way Marcus had. She simply stopped answering when Ruth tried, gently and repeatedly, to bring the two sisters back into the same room for even a short conversation. Some betrayals, once fully understood by everyone involved, do not leave room for reconciliation, and Vanessa seemed to know that better than anyone else in the family. The relatives who had once gathered around Sunday dinners and engagement photographs splintered quietly into 2 separate camps, one built on the marriage Marcus and Vanessa had constructed out of secrecy, and one built on the partnership Danielle and Walter had constructed out of mutual respect. Neither side spoke much to the other after that, and the silence between them said more than any argument ever could have. In the 2 years that followed, the company grew in ways Walter openly admitted he could never have managed on his own. Danielle brought in a logistics software system that cut delivery delays by nearly a third. She renegotiated 3 major supplier contracts that had gone untouched for over a decade, saving the business more in a single quarter than Marcus had ever generated in salary during his brief, half-hearted stint working there years earlier. Employees who had watched the family drama unfold from a distance noticed the difference in leadership almost immediately. The meetings that started running on time, the decisions that got made instead of endlessly deferred. Walter began introducing Danielle to longtime clients not as his wife first, but as his partner, a distinction he made deliberately every single time. Marcus, for his part, spent those same years watching from an outside he had built entirely for himself. He and Vanessa moved twice. First to a smaller apartment when his father quietly stopped subsidizing the lifestyle Marcus had grown used to, and then again when a business venture he started without his father's guidance failed within 18 months. Vanessa took a job she had never planned on needing, and the marriage that had once felt so inevitable to both of them began carrying a weight neither of them had anticipated when they first started sneaking around behind Danielle's back. Neither of them spoke publicly about regret, but Ruth, who still saw Vanessa occasionally at family gatherings neither Danielle nor Walter attended, said there was a tiredness in her younger daughter's face that had not been there before, the particular exhaustion of living inside a decision that had cost far more than either of them expected it to. There was a moment, roughly a year and a half after the wedding, when Marcus attempted one final confrontation, showing up unannounced at the company's main office demanding to see his father. Walter met him in the parking lot rather than let him inside, a decision that told Marcus everything he needed to know before either of them said a word. The conversation was short. Marcus asked, one more time, whether any part of the succession plan could still include him. Walter's answer was honest in a way that finally seemed to reach his son. telling him that the door had never actually been closed, that it had simply required him to show up consistently, prove himself reliable, and treat the people around him with the respect they deserved. The same standard Walter had always held for everyone, including Danielle. Marcus left that parking lot without another word, and the two men did not speak again for the better part of a year afterward. Danielle never described what happened as revenge, not to her mother, not to Walter, and not even to herself in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to think about it honestly. She described it, when she described it at all, as the natural result of paying attention to the people who deserved it and stepping fully away from the ones who did not. She had spent years pouring effort into a relationship with a man who could not be bothered to sit beside her hospital bed during the worst week of her life, and she spent the following years building something lasting with a man who valued every single hour she gave him. The company thrived under their shared leadership, growing steadily in ways that surprised even longtime employees who had watched Walter run it alone for 3 decades. Marcus, for his part, spent those years learning too late what it costs to underestimate someone simply because you assumed, incorrectly, that she had been left with nothing. The question people always ask when they hear this story for the first time is whether Danielle regrets any part of it, whether some quiet corner of her wishes she had confronted Marcus and Vanessa directly instead of building something slower and more permanent in their place. She has never given a simple answer to that question, and maybe that absence of a simple answer is the most honest response there is. What she will say, every time, without hesitation, is that the people who hurt her assumed her silence meant surrender. They mistook grief for weakness, and weakness for an ending. What none of them ever accounted for was what a woman is capable of building when everyone around her stops paying attention, certain that her story is already over. It almost never is. And for Danielle Freeman, the story that began in an empty hospital room became the foundation of everything she built afterward, standing taller, more certain, and more herself than she had ever been before the people who claimed to love her decided she wasn't worth staying for. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments what part stayed with you the longest. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one when it comes.